This is a radio broadcast addressed from the League of Nations on the global war effort against the Morgana threat, where we report the recent happenings amongst the major nations contributing to the defense of our united front. I am your speaker, Ammaraglio Maus, but you may refer to me as Commissar, or simply the Speaker, whichever you or your government prefers. It's the second week of January, and it seems that in lieu of recent aggressions in the European war and large-scale attacks on one another, INPF-flagged vessels are now being sunk in the crossfire. If the conflict continues to escalate, we could very well see a total collapse in negotiations as all-out war breaks out on the continent and in the surrounding seas. And to make it worse, an alarming statement from Morgana claiming that the Morgana war as a whole is reaching a new phase, and that only worse was to come. First up, news from the League of Nations. This week, members of the League of Nations made two momentous decisions about the administration of the new INPF port of Narvik. One, that neutrality did not preclude nations at war conducting trade at the port so long as the items in question were not themselves in violation of League mandates, and that neutrality did not preclude the port playing a role in a logistical chain for combatant nations. In practice, this meant that the Allies could ship weapons by rail from Narvik to Finland, and that more generally neighboring powers could transfer and stockpile weapons locally. However, it was not a uniformly popular set of decisions, as only 54% of members were in support. But at the same time, it offered opportunities to anyone who cared to grab for them. The League also concluded that it was impractical and unsafe to transport the entire dead Vanity from Athens to Norfolk, Virginia. Instead, steps would be taken to secure and study the hulk on site. Sources say the Italians were pleased, the Greeks largely horrified, likely fearing that it might reawaken. And there might be some truth to this, as the hulk, dead or not, was known to groan uncannily at night. After that comes news from the Allies. On January 11th, the Allies signed a treaty of mutual assistance with Turkey, deepening a bond of mutual assistance that had taken on a new significance as Morgana pillaged the Mediterranean. At the same time, they quietly signaled that they wouldn't go out of their way to complicate Mussolini's goals in the Balkans, suggesting to an exhausted Prince Paul of Yugoslavia that peaceful assent to the Italian Greater Balkan Neutrality Pact plan would do more to ensure Yugoslavian well-being in the long run than a reckless push for independence. It wasn't pretty, but it was realistic. Sources say that Mussolini was delighted by the entire business, Hitler less so. But in a way, the biggest story of the week began the day before, on January 10th, with what would soon be known as the Mechlin Affair. In it, Major Erich Huhnmans, the base commander of Lordenheide Airfield, took Major Helmuth Reinberger for a flight in a Messerschmitt 108 Typhoon, and got wildly lost, eventually crash landing in Belgium. Unfortunately for them both, Reinberger happened to be carrying plans for Case Yellow, a planned German invasion of the Low Countries. Bad luck and an unsteady temperament kept Reinberger from successfully destroying the plans, and they ultimately ended up in the hands of Belgian intelligence, along with the hapless officers too. The Anglo-French War Council soon got word of what the Belgians had found, and the obvious problem presented itself. The story was so ridiculous it almost had to be disinformation, something to throw Hitler's enemies off guard in the aftermath of the Helgoland setback. But ultimately, the Allies and the Belgians and the Dutch came to a different conclusion. The Morgana War had taught them that one could never go too far wrong expecting the worst. Case Yellow would be taken very seriously indeed. Following that comes news from the Axis powers, more specifically Germany. Sources say that it was not a happy week for Hitler and his circle. On January 11th, after the League rulings over Narvik, and amid rumors that Britain and France were taking Mussolini's side in this so-called ridiculous Greater Balkan Neutrality Pact project, as well as turning their backs on Prince Paul, army forces were sent to the Yugoslavian border following orders from the war plan Pressure Play. Prince Paul would have to know that there were other parties very interested indeed in the diplomatic decisions facing Belgrade's future. But that's not all. January 11th was also the day that the men in Berlin realized that the plans for Fall Gelb, the planned attack on France through the Low Countries and Ardennes, had gone up in a plane and gone down in a crash somewhere in Belgium. Worse so, intelligence indicates that the Allies were provided a copy. In response to the incident, Hitler immediately fired the commander of Luftwaffe Zwei, General Helmuth Felmy, and Felmy's chief of staff, Colonel Josef Kammhuber. But the plan clearly could not proceed without modification. Perhaps now more unusual ideas might be entertained by the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht to see their goals through. In the meantime, U-boats were directed to raid more fiercely than ever before. They would keep the enemy off balance while the fiasco of Helgoland and the Mechlin incident played out. Following that comes news from the Comintern. This week, the Comintern decided to step away from North America and instead doubled down on its investments in France. This country was the linchpin to any effort to affect Allied politics. It was long the home of ardent communist sympathizers, no matter how thoroughly they may have been scattered to the winds. And, above all, it was the home of the P.C. Brunner Morgana Signals Project. On the 11th, urgent dispatches from field agents were sent to the consulate in Paris. An hour later, the chimney of the embassy was observed smoking heavily. An hour after that, the chief of the delegation had left for Moscow by aircraft. Clearly, despite the trouble they may have created, they seemed to be successful in their task, whatever that may have been. Following the reports from the world's factions comes news from Italy, the world's leading nation in combating the Morgana threat. After having their broadcast seized by Vanity on New Year's Day, the people of Italy were preparing to wage war against Vanity and the band of Morgana she intended to bring into the Mediterranean. Whilst they were preparing, on January 7th, agents of Despair sent the Italian government an unpalatable offer. Despair told the SIS that Mussolini's end was inevitable, his reign poisoned from its earliest origins, and that he would one day be killed by the people of Italy, unless he found a better way to die first. But for all that, she despised Vanity, and was willing to help the Italians forestall the unpleasantness that the conference all but guaranteed. If Italy agreed to exhume and give her the body of Antonio Fogazzaro and allow her a free hand along the coast of North Africa, she would take care of the rest, and as a show of good faith she was prepared to tell them exactly where Vanity's conference would be held. Mussolini said no. It was stated that Italian intelligence would find out everything they needed to know, and indeed the SIS received an immediate increase in funding, and Despair and her shabby fortune-telling could go back to the Alboran Sea until such a time as Italy could be bothered to sink her. Despair seemed distinctly unimpressed, and indeed later in the week she apparently left the hulk of a dead disease on the Libyan coast as a sign of contempt. During all this drama, there was some discussion of rebasing the battle fleet in Mogadishu, where a rise in the presence and toxicity of Morgana mist alongside repeated ghost fleet sightings and derelict fishing boats were all driving the local population to a state of near panic. But in the end, Rome ruled against it. It was all too likely that the enemy was actually trying to lure the Regia Marina away from Italian soil in anticipation of Vanity's great performance. With 87% in favor, the war plan home in Toronto was enacted, retaining the Regia Marina's presence in the Mediterranean. Following that comes news from France, the second leading member contributing to our war against the Morgana. On Saturday, January 6th, French listening stations along the March received a number of insistent radio blasts from their long-time anonymous Morgana source. What she told them was that the arrival of Sloth, the German Helgoland experiment, and the coming Vanity Conference all collectively signaled a new phase in the war, and that she refused to be forgotten as humanity faced the coming storm, because, quote, being forgotten is boring, end quote. The Mystery Morgana offered a deal. If the French would give her the means to communicate with people regularly, and if they would promise to listen to her, she would at least occasionally be helpful. If not, she would have to find ways to make them listen to her, maybe by kidnapping civilian sailors and rewiring them into her own private loudspeakers, like those, quote, poor Spanish guys, end quote. After some albeit hesitant deliberation, 92% of the Daladier government were in favor of and passed the aptly named war plan, Turn the Radio On. Subsequently, a private channel was set up between Miss Morgana and P.C. Bruno. One reward was immediately forthcoming. She confirmed that she was mischief, and that most of the time all it would take to make her happy was to have somebody laugh as she made up her own lyrics to Lucien Boyer's songs. The Marine Nationale and the Daladier government pondered the next steps. Maybe she could be useful, or maybe she was too great a risk to be indulged. Also on January 6th, the Marine Nationale sank a German munition ship, one with a belle aboard, named Ammaraglio, in a confused skirmish with a pair of cowardesses and a disease a few kilometers north of the island of Norderney. The crew and the belle, the Georgia Leia, swore that they fired on her after dark in the mistaken impression that she was disease. But neither the Germans nor the League were entirely convinced. It would seem that after Helgoland, tensions were running too high. After that, we head over to the Pacific to hear the latest from the Empire of Japan, the third contributing nation to our united front. With ties to the Soviets being rebuilt in the north and preparations to address delusions, labyrinthine maze in the South China Sea, this week saw preparation for campaigns by both the First and Second Fleet. In the north, the First Fleet brushed up against, but did not provoke, the Morgana presence at the Strait of Tartary in support of Imperial Japanese Army forces in northern Hokkaido and South Karafudo. The enemy presence at the mouth of the Ammaraglio River represented a threat to both Japan and the USSR alike, and it was expected that the two sides would join together to burn the enemy out in the following days, and special meetings were held with officers from the Soviet Pacific Fleet in preparation. Of course, the Morgana made ready as well. The Second Fleet pulled back from Delusion's maze and the unnavigable stew that had engulfed the South China Sea. The experts studying the maze would advise them in time. For now, the Second Fleet instead moved to support the Dutch and the Australians in the Bismarck Sea. Morgana activity was rising there and threatening spill out into the waters closer to home. Sources say it was tense work, even if the fighting wasn't overwhelming. In mainland Asia, the Battle of Kunlun Pass ended in a Chinese victory, and the hopes of threatening Chongqing from the south were dashed at almost complete destruction of the 21st Brigade of the 5th Division. Chinese forces suffered tremendous losses in the process as well, but further offensive action by the Japanese had been blunted for the time being. Elsewhere, the pace of combat in northern China is increasing, and in particular, guerrilla actions are taking their toll on the Imperial Japanese Army. After that, we head east over the Pacific to hear news from the United States, the fourth contributing nation in our war against the Morgana. The powers that be in the United States government, more specifically the Senate and the House of Representatives, were at odds yet again over the latest proposed war plan. Some representatives claimed that those in the Senate and the U.S. Navy were being far too aggressive in their pursuits of Pacific pacification, and that such a push is endangering trade and diplomacy in the region. Impassioned senators then again refer to the representatives as the silent majority, who are willing to stand by quietly as the Morgana destroy the world. Despite the fiery tempers, deliberation continued, and the war plan focused Bering Sea past with a meager 65% majority. And it was fortunate it did, as on January 10th the Pacific Fleet engaged the Morgana raiders that had been active off Canada's Pacific coast, a rather formidable collection of corruptions and sins that laughingly announced that they were on leave from the main force at the Aleutian Islands, and looking for a good time. In what immediately came to be known as the coast-to-coast attack, Portland and California immediately turned their main guns on the lead Sin, who literally snapped in two and under a minute of the coastal battery sustained fire. The Battle of Juan de Fuca Strait was done in under 4 hours. No American ships were lost and no Morgana survived. The fleet was recalled before progressing further northwards. Aerial scouting indicated a Morgana mist presence spilling out of the Bering Sea that would offer battle under very unfavorable terms. In other news, American policymakers with input from the United States Navy also discussed expanding support for China in the face of ongoing Japanese aggression, and with rumors of a new puppet government in the wings. With Nanning fallen, the Chinese almost certainly needed more help than they were getting. But at the same time, fighting Morgana in the Pacific required a minimum of cooperation with Japan, and there had been signs ever since Prime Minister Yunai came to office that Japan could be more reasonable than under the previous administration. The U.S. decided, for the time being at least, to make China's case diplomatically rather than physically to avoid rocking the proverbial boat, truly showing the dichotomy of United States politics. Following that comes news from our comrades in the North, the Soviet Union, who are the 5th contributing member to our united front. The great success of the week came in the Baltic on the 6th of January, with a near-flawless assault on the Finnish Koivisto Islands. Finnish defenders were scattered and troops were successfully delivered to the beaches with not a single ship lost. The conquest of the islands now threatens Suma, where the Finnish defenders in the south have stopped the Red Army since December. The harder battle came 2 days later in the Gulf of Bothnia, not so far from Rye, where an unseasonable heat had lingered for weeks. There were Morgana devices, of course. FNS Väinämöinen led a strike on one cluster, while members of the Soviet Baltic Fleet hit the rest, and stumbled upon a resurgent sloth, whom they had thought, and hoped, vanished from the Baltic altogether. She and her hanger-ons attacked with reckless abandon, and the shallow waters in the north made fighting painfully complicated. The submarine SHCH-310 ran aground and was destroyed, and the destroyer Minsk was bombed and burned as she engaged with multiple Morgana. She was last seen clearly out of control and steaming northwards. Her turrets still fired defiantly at the enemy, however. They were both avenged by the destroyer Skoy, whose guns shredded Sloth's engines after an uncannily swift pivot and approach from the stern. After that, the Morgana Sloth tore her bottom open on the rocks and sank swiftly. With Sloth gone, the Morgana devices were easily eliminated. It should be noted that both the Soviets and FNS Väinämöinen chose to destroy the Morgana technology rather than claim it. Neither of their superiors would necessarily have approved, but an alliance had formed that would likely survive the Winter War, whatever the outcome. Meanwhile, the Baltic Fleet had no ships to spare when the NKVD called for the shelling of malcontents and saboteurs at the Ordzhonikid shipyard. Apparently, heated discussions followed in both Leningrad and Moscow, and what also followed was an attack on the shipyard from the 7th Army. They were, from the Navy's perspective, profoundly sloppy, bombarding in the vicinity of the unfinished Sovietsky Soyuz for hours. No saboteurs emerged alive and no Army soldiers were hurt in the end, but the unfinished hull of Soyuz was heavily damaged. One side effect of this was insistence from on high that the Baltic Fleet be on the lookout for dozens of cowards formerly under the command of Konberg Vinogradov, who had broken ranks and fled from combat, possibly against soldiers with Morgana weaponry, according to some rumors. It was thought that they might flee to the sea and try to take advantage of the INPF's liberal recruitment policies to escape justice. That, obviously, would not be permitted if the NKVD had anything to say about it. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the fleet gathered again in anticipation of a push to liberate the Ammaraglio River from the Morgana threat, with or without Japanese aid, sources say. Following that comes news from the United Kingdom, who managed to surpass Germany this week as the 6th contributing member in our war against the Morgana. After laying down the groundwork for protecting the Suez Canal, the Royal Navy began this week by redirecting their efforts towards the North Sea. On January 8th, the Home Fleet launched a second attack on the Morgana Line, now jokingly referred to as the Morgana Q by sailors who noted its lack of movement. It was as it had been 2 weeks before. Vanities and sins, and the sky streaked with the smoke of warped aircraft. The Brits were better prepared this time, but the fighting was still terrible. Travel-class destroyers set loose on the line to turn the enemy's attention away from the likes of HMS Revenge and HMS Glorious were hit the hardest. Punjabi and Somali were sunk outright, the latter actually giving her life to catch a torpedo meant for HMS Repulse. And Tartar, Bedouin, and Eskimo all suffered casualties in the dozens or worse. Still, Bedouin and Mohawk together brought down Vanity, and the tribals came away with new, well-earned respect. When the fighting cooled, the Morgana Line, or what was left of it, retreated to the north, sacrificing bombers on suicide runs to gain some space. It was a win for Britain and the Royal Navy, and it left a wealth of Morgana salvage in its wake, even if it didn't exactly clarify the matter of what the Morgana had been out to protect in the first place. Meanwhile, at the Seychelles Islands, Miriam Van and the researchers of HMS Pembroke VII set up camp to try and track the invisible Morgana fleet in the Indian Ocean, and to reassure the locals that they were not forgotten. As to the first of these goals, early results seemed very favorable. By the end of the week, Dr. Vane was prepared to say that the leader of the Morgana project was paranoia, and that paranoia's force was perhaps not as large as she wanted humanity to believe. As to the second of these goals, well, the technology used by the Pembroke team was strange, reports state, and it made a humming sound that did notable harm to the local residents' sleeping habits. They were not popular guests, and the people of the Seychelles were not entirely reassured. In other news, Britain suffered one other loss. The submarine Starfish was sunk in Dutch waters by the German destroyer Georg Thiele, despite the fact that she had a bell and was flying INPF colors. The captain in the bell of the Thiele swore that he thought she was a starvation, and the Thiele did make an effort to rescue survivors. But it was broad daylight when the shells were fired, and Starfish wasn't underwater at the time. Britain has filed a number of complaints with the League and called for an investigation. However, the League has stated nothing regarding the issue at this time. Lastly, but certainly not least, comes news from the Reich, Germany, whose efforts seem to be stagnating in recent weeks, as they've now found themselves the seventh contributing nation against the Morgana threat. In the aftermath of the previous week's Helgoland disaster, the Kriegsmarine's U-boats redoubled their raiding efforts, but most of the surface ships fell back to Bremerhaven and to their regular North Sea patrols. The Oberkommando der Marine also offered particular instructions to convey any messages that might be sent by a mistrust, but none were forthcoming. Meanwhile, extra support was offered to the Soviet Baltic Fleet, supplies for Soviet submarines, and a great deal of intelligence on Finnish shipping and coastal defenses, courtesy of Berlin. In a different week, the Germans might have been more subtle about it, but now they made the case to anyone who cared to listen that the Soviets were fighting for the good of humanity against the Morgana-tainted Finns, and that, if anything, more urgency was called for to root out the rogue elements to humanity's united front. Germany, too, they stress, had begun the righteous work of rooting out collaborators with humanity's great enemy, particularly in the Polish-speaking cosmopolitan centers of Warthegau and West Prussia. It should also be noted that the Finnish belle Väinämöinen laid a curse on Germany's leadership. No one was quite sure how to take it, though certain members of the Anna Urba seemed genuinely unsettled. Moreover, Germany called for an immediate League sanction against France for the sinking of Annegret, in full and knowing contravention of the Zurich Protocols, stating, "Surely the integrity of the INPF required nothing less," end quote. The matter of Georg Thiele, however, and the sinking of the HMS Starfish was far more cut and dried, and of course could not be attributed to anything more than the fog of war, sources say. And with that concludes the League of Nations War Report for the second week of January. It's quite disheartening to see tensions amongst ourselves continue to rise, even as the forces we fight could bring upon an extinction-level event upon us. Valuable resources and now even bells are being wasted in the European conflict. Hopefully, all sides will see that the true fight lay not with each other, but with the Morgana. And as a reminder to all captains and citizens alike that this League of Nations broadcast is intended on keeping you informed about the unified war effort against the Morgana, but there is more you can do to help both on the front and at home. Has a captain or belle caught your eye? Utilize some of that prestige you've earned to get them a tailored uniform or some nice formal dress wear from your local tailor. If you find yourself lacking in prestige to woo your fellow officers, consider purchasing some war bonds to help the war effort against the Morgana. This is the quickest way to support our boys and girls on the front line, while also netting you prestige among your peers that you can use to get that special someone regalia befitting only of them. Thank you for listening, and may you have smooth seas.